In previous lessons, I've talked about why and how composers use repetition. To summarize briefly, repetition can make the music easier to follow, and it can emphasize important moments. It also creates expectations with which the composer can then play. In this lesson, I want to talk about what I call turning points during recapitulations, places in the form where the music goes in one direction in its original presentation, but then takes a different turn later when the same material comes back. I've already mentioned this in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, where the strange fermata on G in the violins in the opening of the exposition prepares the way for the wonderful oboe solo in the recapitulation, greatly expanding the music's emotional range. Here I want to look first at some turning points in Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, and then in my own Fourth Symphony. In Mozart's and Haydn's symphonies, usually the exposition is repeated, literally. But eventually composers began to realize that this repetition presented an opportunity for something richer. And so we find more and more examples of expositions with two different endings, one of which leads back to the start of the exposition, and another which leads to the development section. This is a simple but powerful way to achieve two goals. First, the actual repetition of the exposition lets the listener learn the material better, so as to more easily understand its subsequent development. Second, it creates an exciting surprise when the second ending leads to a different direction. Let's look at this in Beethoven's Eroica. The exposition ends in measure 152. The first ending takes the dominant ninth chord from measure 50 and directs it back to the beginning. Unfortunately, the only recording that isn't under copyright restrictions doesn't include the repeat, so I can't play it here. The second ending sequences the melodic figure with the dominant ninth, using it to modulate in measure 160 to the dominant of C minor, where Beethoven then starts to develop material from the second theme. Here's the second version. Another turning point in this movement first occurs in measure 7 of the exposition. The C sharp of the bass creates a moment of harmonic uncertainty. When it first happens, it quickly resolves to D as part of the dominant seventh chord of the home key, E flat major. When this passage recurs in measure 402, the C sharp acts like a D flat going down to C, which turns out to be the dominant of F major. So this changes the color of the recapitulation, leading it in a new harmonic direction. In sonata form, there's another place where a turning point normally leads to something different. That is to say, where the second theme or theme group arrives in the tonic during the recapitulation, as opposed to the exposition, where it normally appears in some closely related key. This is a very well-known phenomenon, so I won't quote examples here, but it uses the same formal principle. Repetition creates expectations and then plays with them. And finally, one place where Beethoven in particular used this turning point principle is the end of the recapitulation. In many sonata forms of earlier composers, the composer simply repeats the end of the exposition, now in the tonic key, to end the movement. Beethoven more and more uses this moment to set off a long coda, which acts almost like a second development, so that the ending of the recapitulation becomes more dramatic and intense than the exposition. We've already listened to the end of the exposition previously. Here's the comparable passage in the recapitulation. As we see here, Beethoven sequences the end of the exposition to lead off into a long and elaborate coda. The other work I want to use as an example here is the first movement of my own Fourth Symphony. Here I've tried to apply what I've learned from the great masters in my own music. While this music is not exactly a classical sonata form, it does include a recapitulation of the opening thematic material. What I aimed at was to present its return in a somewhat different mood, trying to make it more magical for the listener. Here's the first presentation from the opening of the movement. The basic musical idea here is a combination of two planes of tone in the strings and the timpani. The latter adds something more serious, perhaps even a bit threatening, to the singing character of the violins. Starting in measure 14, the horns had a new harmonic layer below the violins, and the timpani disappear. Then in measure 22, the horns disappear and a clarinet solo creates a sort of dialogue with the violins. At this point, the timpani return. Let's listen. When this comes back after a climax based on other material, in measure 136 to 7, now the strings suggest the original theme and the clarinet recalls a bit of their previous dialogue. Then, starting in measure 143, the strings, timpani, and clarinet return. But I've tried to make this return special by adding a new background accompaniment. I wanted to create something more magical with the vibraphone and harp. The horns only return after this in measure 159. Let's listen. So this is a recapitulation of the original material, but the order of its presentation and the character are now different. And this is something I learned from looking at masterworks by Beethoven and others, how it is possible to enlarge the emotional range of our musical ideas by rethinking their context when they return. So the listener recognizes the material but now sees it in a different light. In this way, repetition, instead of just being a mechanical reflex, as in some pop music, becomes a way to greatly enrich the listener's experience via a turning point.